Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us tonight for our first CWD info session. As we explained in our outreach and advertising, that we're running this as a Zoom meeting tonight. The goal of the Zoom meeting is that you get to directly engage with Cait rather than just sitting through a presentation or typing in your chats. So the agenda is going to be, we'll do a little brief introduction. Cait's going to do a short presentation, which will just refresh everybody on the status of CWD, where we're at in the province. And then we're going to go into more of the dialogue with everybody. So I'm Amberly Ficacello, Hunters for BC, one of the directors. I'm here with my co-chair, Evan Holmgren. He co-chairs on the CWD committee with me. And then obviously our special guest tonight is Cait Nelson. We work quite closely with Cait to make sure we're trying to deliver the latest and greatest information. And just before I get started with Cait, I'm just going to do a land acknowledgement. As a provincial organization, we acknowledge with gratitude and respect that our work takes place on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Indigenous peoples throughout British Columbia. We honor the diverse nations who have cared for the lands and waters since time immemorial. We are committed to building respectful relationships with Indigenous communities and supporting stewardship efforts that reflect shared values for wildlife and habitat conservation. So, with the formalities out of the way, everybody, I would like you to meet, if you haven't previously, Cait Nelson. She is our health biologist based out of Nanaimo, and she is the champion of CWD for us in our province. Thanks for joining us tonight, Cait.
Thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to be able to have this opportunity to connect with folks. So I love the format. This is a great opportunity. So yeah, I just have a short presentation, like Amberly said. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and then we can go over that. And I hope there's going to be lots of time after for questions and discussion. So let's see if I can share the screen. How does that look?
It's good.
Okay, excellent. Okay. All right. So again, thanks for this. My name is Cait Nelson. I'm a wildlife health biologist, and I work with the BC Wildlife Health Program based on Vancouver Island. But we tackle a number of different wildlife health initiatives across the province. We work within the Ministry of Waterlands and Resource Stewardship, and my main focus for the last 15 years has been on chronic wasting disease in BC. So, sorry, just trying to advance here. Here we go. So, the first couple slides, just going to cover some basics on chronic wasting disease. So this is a complicated disease. I'm just going to touch on a few key things. When we can dig further into the disease after the presentation, if there's still questions. CWD is a neurological disease, always fatal. It's caused by an abnormal protein called a prion that accumulates in the tissue of an animal, primarily in the central nervous system and the brain, which leads to that neurological disease and neurological deterioration. We This disease affects the species in the deer family, so that includes deer, elk, moose, and caribou. And we can't say for certain. Oops, sorry, we can't say for certain that that this disease wouldn't affect other species, but we just haven't seen that in the wild. What we have seen is mainly in deer, but also in elk and moose populations, that this disease causes reduced survival rates and reduced population growth rates. So over time, we see population declines. And some places that have not been successful in managing CWD have actually seen upwards of 50% decline in deer and elk populations. And these numbers unfortunately continue to go down. Populations do not recover from chronic wasting disease as they might from some other disease outbreaks. There is no evidence that CWD can transfer to people. but public health cannot rule it out completely. So the health authorities do recommend that infected animals are not eaten. Animals can become infected with this disease through direct contact with infected animals or indirectly by picking up these prions from contaminated environments. So that's the soil, water, plants. They can pick them up and ingest them that way. Infected animals will spread the disease by shedding these prions through their bodily fluids, urine, saliva, feces, or through a carcass decomposing on the land. So this potential to contaminate the environment is one of the most challenging things about CWD because these prions will persist in the environment for several years. They're very resistant to disinfectants, to burning, to freezing. So, this can be an ongoing source of the disease in the environment where other animals can pick it up. And from the food safety perspective, CWD is not like other diseases like parasites, bacteria, that the recommendations are to cook your meat thoroughly, and that will usually destroy, some of these other diseases like bacteria and parasites and make it safe to eat. But that's not the case with prion diseases. Cooking does not eliminate the prion. The other really challenging thing about this disease is that most infected animals appear healthy. And so we call these animals silent carriers or silent carriers for CWD because we rarely see animals with symptoms in the wild. So for us, that's a problem because there's no signal that there's something wrong in these animals or these populations. The reason that this happens is that it takes several months for any symptoms to develop in animals that are infected. Um, and those symptoms tend to show only at the very late stage of the disease before the animal dies. So predators are likely going to pick these animals off before people would notice any sort of change in behavior or condition. Most of the animals that test positive for CWD are healthy looking hunter harvested animals. So even if when you're processing and harvest an animal, there's actually no way to tell if they're infected just by looking. The only way to know for sure is through testing. So the current situation in BC, CWD was first confirmed here in January 2024. That was in two cases that were identified from samples collected in the 2023 hunting season. One was a mule deer buck near Englishman Creek rec site. If you're familiar with that, that's the case, the green star farthest to the south. And the other case that was detected in that first year is the other green star there. It was a white-tailed deer, a doe that was roadkill, collected near the city of Cranbrook. So the province responded with some mandatory testing, some targeted sampling, carcass and transport, or carcass transport and disposal regulations to prevent the disease from spreading. We also established a CWD management zone. And during the 2024 hunting season, we tested over 4,000 animals from this zone and identified an additional 4 cases. All of these new cases were in white-tailed deer. So, uh, there's this cluster identified, the cluster of cases around Cranbrook. It includes one case within the city limits of Cranbrook, and that cluster of cases is our greatest concern for a few different reasons, but mainly because of the density of animals in that area associated with the urban deer population. And related to that is the potential for the disease to spread more rapidly and contaminate the environment there, which then puts the surrounding populations, deer and elk populations, at risk. So far, the evidence from our surveillance suggests that CWD has been detected early, which is really important. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this cluster of cases are around Cranbrook and the lack of cases in the surrounding areas also suggests that the disease may have been brought in on a carcass or contaminated feed material or hay. Um, we uh, We'll never know for sure how the disease came into the province or came into this area, but you would expect to see other cases kind of in the surrounding area if the disease was being transmitted um, from an animal to animal on the landscape, and we're not seeing that. So the surveillance data that, from our testing program over the last couple of years is very strong. And that's mainly thanks to hunters that have provided 82% of the samples last year, which was really incredible. So that has given us really good information. So we have a really good idea, really good picture of the situation here. Um, I should also note that these cases in BC are not our only concern. There are cases to the east in Alberta and south of us in Montana and Idaho and Washington that are very close to the border, and those areas could also bring CWD into BC and into new areas. So we need to keep a close eye on that as well. So what kind of tools do we have to combat this disease, this threat to our wildlife? Thankfully, we've learned so much from the experience of other places over the last couple of decades. One of the most important learnings has been that early detection is really critical. And I mentioned that we believe that we've detected CWD early in BC. Other places that have detected this disease when it's reached, 5% disease prevalence, or it's like been allowed to expand towards 5%. Unfortunately, they've had very little success at controlling it. 5% doesn't seem like a big number, but when it gets to that level, we start to lose our ability to manage and contain it. So catching it early and applying management intervention quickly is really key. Another is precision action. So, what I mean by that is really focused, targeted, small scale management that's based on sound data. Um, this approach has been more effective at controlling CWD, and it's also more accepted by the public, by the partners and the hunting public. Sustained management is required for the long term. With this disease, we cannot just, hit it hard for a couple of years and then see what happens. Once CWD is detected in an area, it needs to become a permanent fixture in the management of those wildlife populations. And unfortunately, it's unlikely to see the effect of management for several years. But what success would look like, looking forward 15 or 20 years, is observing, very slow disease spread or no disease spread, ideally, and very low infection rates over that longer term. And so that's the goal of management. Um, and the last point here that is really key to all of this is that without meaningful consultation and buy-in from hunters in particular and the public, you risk losing that critical support, and that unfortunately has happened, and we've seen that in some places where that collaborative approach was either not taken or it wasn't prioritized. So I don't think that we will ever see 100% agreement, but I do think it's really important that we need to keep working towards CWD management that our key partners are supportive of and are part of, and because hunting is really the most important tool in CWD management. So, specifically, what has worked in these other places, the recommendations are really centered around three strategies: targeting identified CWD cases, using harvest management to target high-risk segments of the population, and limiting as much as possible localized transmission and contamination. So how do we do that? Hunter-led surveillance and testing is key to identifying CWD cases. Once those CWD cases are identified, then we can develop those precision strategies to remove infected animals from those areas. This can be done through hunter harvest, which is the most favorable method. But in some cases, sharpshooting, darting, trapping has been applied. Again, it's really from learnings from other places, the really precision, small scale approaches in that context has been the most effective. Um, but ideally, it would involve some combination of these approaches for the maximum efficacy. Harvest management is also utilized, can be directed towards the higher risk segments of the population, but this really depends on the situation. So in many cases elsewhere, the disease has really primarily been driven by adult male deer. This is true for Alberta, for example. So in those cases, adjusting seasons, hunting seasons to increase male harvest, really um, targeting sort of post rut when the seed transmission rates are the highest. That has been effective in those situations. But in BC, our data is not really showing that. We're seeing an even split between males and females in the cases that we've had so far with a sample size of 6. But still, we're seeing uh, even distribution in cases between males and females. So that's potentially going to require a different strategy. That even sex ratio between males and females is more typical of what we see in captive herds on farms, also in urban deer populations, which would make sense with the cluster of cases around Cranbrook. So again, that's going to take a different strategy to address that situation. But that really relates to, brings us to reducing transmission and contamination at a local level, and addressing sort of high risk situations like unnatural aggregation of animals that are, animals brought in to point sources of food, um, to, situations where you have high fidelity animals visiting the same sites over and over again. This is where we see high disease transmission rates and high rates of environmental contamination. And so again, that's something that we see associated with practices like feeding and baiting in urban deer populations. Of all three of these strategies, what's recommended is really a combination. And what we've seen in other places, that when a combination of these tools are applied, is when they have the most success. So in BC, we have a continuous planning process to make sure that we are always learning and adapting to new information. And we're still in early days, but we set up this framework, quite some time ago when we developed our plan to make sure that we were always learning and always adapting. So first, our planning is really grounded in science and sound information that we're gathering through surveillance and research. We summarize that information and present that to our advisory teams, our collaborative team, to review and evaluate, so that we can then kind of zero in on the risks and prioritize where we are directing our efforts. This then will form the strategies and recommendations that our collaborative team will present to the decision makers, who then will give us the green light, will approve moving forward with implementing actions. And then it all starts again, and it's kind of this continuous loop of, what is the evidence showing us? What are the tools available to us for these situations? How is the community and the public responding to the management? And then how do we need to adjust as we go? So one of the tools that we have and this is just one tool, but I was going to focus on a little bit more tonight, are regulations. So we've been planning and implementing strategies for many years in BC. Some of our CWD regulations are going back 15 years, like the carcass import regulation, and the ban on cervid materials that are used for scents and lures. These were all designed to prevent CWD from entering BC. Um, and they still apply. The threat of CWD coming in from Alberta or coming up from Montana remains relevant. So we need that. We also need to prevent CWD from spreading further, like within BC. Mandatory testing is another tool that was implemented in specific management units in 2019 as the disease was kind of creeping closer to the border and that risk was increasing. Um, we are now also like now, so these were the regulations that were in place before, but now, since last year, we're addressing CWD within the province. So more recently, implementing regulations in our CWD management zone that aim to contain CWD and prevent the spread, and also support surveillance through the testing program. So this is the last slide here. I'm just going to kind of run through how the regulations are typically developed for CWD. There are two different pieces of legislations that provide authority and a few different kind of channels of how regulations may be proposed and adopted. So, under the Wildlife Act, which is one piece of legislation, those proposals may originate from our regional wildlife staff or through our wildlife health team. If the region is proposing it, then they tend to go through regional hunting and trapping advisory tables that they have established. They would also kind of come through our wildlife health team for consultation as well. Um, in other cases, proposals are initiated from our wildlife health team and then passed through our CWD committee or committees that include First Nations, hunting and trapping organizations, and academic advisors and expert advisors as well from other places. Those collaborative tables, whether they're the regional tables or our CWD committees, will provide input, and that input is then submitted to the decision maker. So the decision maker is different depending on the different proposals. Um, but yeah, under the Wildlife Act there, you see some of the different regulations or restrictions that have come to be under our CWD regulation framework there. The other piece of legislation is the Animal Health Act. That gives us some power for responding to reportable diseases, which chronic wasting disease is a reportable disease under the reportable and notifiable disease regulation. So the chief veterinary officer with Ministry of Agriculture is the decision maker under this act, whereas the Wildlife Act will cover, harvested animals. A general order under the Animal Health Act can kind of fill the gaps and extend to animals that are found dead, things like roadkill. And so, this last year, they implemented a general order under the Animal Health Act for that, mandatory testing and the transport and disposal restrictions for the roadkill. And then we complemented that with our mandatory testing and carcass restrictions under the condition of a hunting license under our Wildlife Act. So they kind of work together that way. That's it. I just had this final slide here with my contact information, but I don't know if you want me to continue sharing or we can just go into the questions and discussion.
Honestly, Cait, I am all for the questions and the discussions. That's really, really what we want to provide an opportunity for hunters to engage and chat and feel like they have a voice and that they can connect and speak to those things really specifically. So thank you so much for that. Just for our audience, if you know where to find your mute button, where to find your put your hand up button, you can also use the chat. But we do really want to have some conversation. there's always a little bit of a voice delay through these digital meetings. So, interruptions can sometimes occur accidentally. Don't worry about it. Just, we'll kind of stumble through it and that sort of thing. But yeah, so that's really how we want to roll throughout the rest of the evening and give everybody that chance to chat. So I see Robin Unruh is here. He's actually Hunters for BC president. And your hand is up, Robin, so jump away. And Evan and I will tag team back and forth with the questions and stuff like that.
Thanks. Hi, Cait. Great to see you again. And
Hi.
thank you, Cait, and Evan and Amberly, for putting this on. Um, and thanks for everybody for showing up to this. And if there's anybody in East Kootenays or Rocky Mountain Trench, just know that I feel for the community over there. It's definitely not something that you want in your neighborhood. And you know, it's devastating. I do have basically two-tier sort of question, and you mentioned that we're learning about successes and failures in other jurisdictions. Now, I wanted to touch base a little bit on Saskatchewan. I think it was 1994 when CWD was first detected in Saskatchewan, so that's going on 31 years if I'm able to count all my fingers and toes. So um, Saskatchewan started out uh, very heavily proactive on trying to contain CWD. Now, through probably a lot of political decisions, public pressure, I think they let their foot off the throttle and kind of it got away on them. Even to the point that correct me if I'm wrong on any stats, but I think there's some areas of Saskatchewan's where 85% of male mule deer tested um, are positive for CWD,
Yeah.
which is a very important statistic because in the hunting community we get a lot of people um, that are very resistant to the idea of CWD, thinking it's a government wash or a conspiracy theory. There's a lot of misinformation going on out there. So we don't have to look very far east to Saskatchewan to really get an idea what can happen in 30 years. So my question here is, what are our neighbors doing, specifically Alberta, Idaho, Montana, and Washington?
Yeah. Great question. And yeah, your stats on Saskatchewan are correct. Unfortunately, the experience in Saskatchewan and Alberta are, and although we've learned a lot from the experience, especially in Alberta, they've done a lot of good work and research that we've been able to learn from. But unfortunately, in those cases, their management was not successful, and the disease got away on them. So those are sort of the examples of what we don't want to recreate that. We've learned a lot, and we don't want to repeat the mistakes that were made. In both cases, and again, I should qualify too that Alberta and Saskatchewan are very different landscapes than BC, and the disease will behave differently in these different landscapes, and so it's not always going to be the same outcome. BC is very different. But in the case of Alberta and Saskatchewan, they both came out of the gate with very aggressive management policies, broad scale culls, and things of that nature that were very unpopular. Um, in the context of disease, and I think they were working with the best information that we had at that time. In those days, we didn't even know that CWD could persist in the environment. Like we didn't understand the dynamics of the disease at that time. And so our context were, other prion diseases like like mad cow disease, where it's a prion disease, but it's different because infected cattle don't shed the disease into the environment, and so that was kind of the context. So Alberta and Saskatchewan came out and they said, okay, let's stamp it out, let's kill these animals, let's stop it in its tracks, and was probably, somewhat effective in removing infected animals from the landscape, but it was largely unpopular. And like you said, the political and public pressure shut it down and shut down sort of any hope for, you know, try having a second go, having a second chance, because there was so much disapproval of how they initially reacted, and there was no support to continue management for a long time. And unfortunately, in those years, the disease took off to a point now where they're considered endemic areas, and managing or containing the disease now is unlikely. So they're monitoring, they're tracking, we're still trying to learn. We're still learning a ton from these areas, and how this disease kind of behaves on different landscapes. Um, One of the key findings from Alberta, actually from their removal and testing program, is that we figured out that chronic wasting disease is not evenly distributed on the landscape. It's really clustered, and so if you they called a large number of animals and tested them all, and what they found was the CWD cases were all in these tight little clusters. And so that was really an important finding to, like, okay, how do we manage this disease more effectively? And that was, um, influenced how we approach it today with let's do a hunter-led surveillance, collecting samples from hunters from harvested animals to test those animals. Then we can identify cases and then really zero in. Nobody is considering large scale culls anymore because they're unnecessary. What we need to do first is understand where the disease is on the landscape and then zero in to like a 1 kilometer radius, and then go and target animals in those very specific areas, has been a lot more effective and a lot more accepted by the hunting community and others. So if we look to the south, where there's some jurisdictions that are having success at containing the disease, they're using those types of approaches. And even Illinois is a good example because they had their first detection around the same time that Alberta, or in the early 2000s. But they, rather than kind of coming out like really aggressively, they really took the time to sit down with the stakeholders and the communities to map it out together, to build the plan together, so that everyone, whatever they were going to do, everyone was on board with it and supportive of it, and hunters were going to be participating in it. And so examples like that have been a lot more successful. Just like those key things that I listed earlier. But really zeroing in and targeting, understanding where the disease is on the landscape, zeroing in on those specific locations to remove those infected animals. And then you're not having to remove that many animals to have the same effectiveness, um, and working, in partnership uh, with hunters, really, and communities and other partners, because this disease, has such far-reaching impacts. Everybody kind of has a stake in it. So many groups have a stake in this, and so we kind of all have to do this together and all be supportive of the plans that are implemented. So.
Thank you so much. That was really good. I hope you get more questions from other viewers here, because if not, I got more. Bye.
Thanks, Robin. Actually, Phil Passmore has a really great question. And Phil, thanks for bringing that forward because it is It's something that we see a lot on social media. Phil, I'm more than happy for you to take yourself off of mute and dialogue directly with Cait, um, and if you're comfortable with that. And I just think it's great for the audience and great for people to just hear from each other and phrase it your way instead of my way. So welcome. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you. Um, I think I've asked you this question before. Personally, I don't think that CWD is anything new. I believe it's been in the herds since time immemorial. But given the vectors of infection and the inability to kill or control the prions in any way, shape, or form, is it not inevitable that, while we may work very hard to get these pockets of infection here, there, and everywhere, is it not inevitable that in time the entire deer herd will be infected?
Thank you for that question, and I think that's really valid. I believe that um, you're right. These prions are very persistent. It's We're never going to be able to eradicate chronic wasting disease from the landscape. But if we sit back and don't try and contain it, and don't, by removing those infected animals from the landscape, we're suppressing that potential for those animals to spread disease and the potential for those animals to shed the prions into the environment. If we can reduce that, if we can turn the dial on that, then I believe that we can slow it down and reduce the potential negative impacts of this disease. If we don't try and actively contain it and manage it, then we're going to be, well, I don't know this for certain, but we're going to be worse off. We might not follow the same path as Alberta and Saskatchewan, because again, this is a very different landscape here, different ecosystem. But if we don't do anything, in 20 years, we could see 25% of the herd infected. If we are on top of it and effective in our management, then we may be able to keep the disease prevalence to 2%. And so I think it's in our best interest, and certainly the best interest of the populations, that if we can turn that dial, and if we can in 20 years go, instead of 25% of the animals infected, 2% of the animals infected, I think it's really worth trying.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that. I just think that
Mhm.
despite our best efforts, until we can figure out how to eliminate the prions itself, then it's going to be an ongoing and never ending battle.
Oh, that's absolutely true. It is going to be a never-ending battle, and we can't take our foot off the gas ever now. This is going to be a permanent, um, a permanent component of population management in BC now, and we can't let up. But I do, I hope that that maybe down the road, maybe we'll be buying ourselves some time, and the advancements in better understanding this prion, and maybe down the road we will have some way to denature the prion in the environment or clean up these environments. And wouldn't that be amazing? So I don't have a crystal ball to know what that is going to look like, but I think we do have some tools, and I think we should apply those tools as best we can to try and limit the negative impacts. And hopefully the tools will just keep getting better and we can keep learning.
Thank you, Cait.
Thanks, Phil, for that. I have John with his hand up. Welcome, John.
Hi, thank you. I've spent some time trying to figure out the disease itself, and I know that's the folding of the protein that causes the trouble. Um, is it in some way more resilient than other proteins that you would see out on the land? Why, and why is it that um, it's shed in deer but not cattle. Is that information you can help me out with?
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I don't fully understand all of it, so I can't fully answer that question. But you're correct in that this protein, of course, we all have proteins in our bodies, and what proteins are supposed to do is they actually denature really um, readily, and they'll break down into their component parts and recycle. And heat, like normal proteins, will break down with heat and different things like that. So that's how a normal functioning protein should operate. But with these prions, and this is the part I don't understand, but apparently there's a misfolding of the prion that just makes them um, resistant to that denaturing process, that makes them resistant, highly resistant to heat, to UV radiation, to chemical, to all those types of things. One of the only ways to actually denature protein or prions is through like industrial grade incineration, like high, not normal incineration or like a big backyard fire, but like really high heat, extended period of time, industrial incineration. And even at the end of that process, it will eliminate like 80% of the prions, but there are still active prions. So it reduces the prion load, but not completely. So that ash is still needs to be handled as like this hazardous waste and buried in a landfill kind of thing. Um, but yeah, it's very strange. And the other thing that the proteins, the prions will do is when they enter um, the body doesn't recognize it as a something that shouldn't be there, like it would recognize a virus or a bacteria. The body just says, "Oh, it's another protein." So that's why we don't have that immune response, and the animals don't show symptoms until kind of the damage has been done in their neurological tissue. But they come into the body, these prions, and when they come in contact with normal proteins, they'll actually convert them to the abnormal prion structure. And so that's how they accumulate in the body, is they're actually converting normal proteins into these abnormal proteins. So that, I mean, that process too, we don't fully understand. Why with chronic wasting disease, the animals shed the disease agent or the prion through their bodily fluids, and with other prion diseases that doesn't happen, we don't actually know. I certainly don't know the answer to that one. So that's a bit of a mystery. Uh, there's still a lot, unfortunately, that we don't know about prion diseases. Even some of the other ones, like there's human variants of prion disease, mad cow disease. There's scrapie in sheep and goats that has been around a lot longer than and we still don't fully understand these diseases. They're quite unusual.
They seem so improbable that chemistry would land them so different than other proteins based on just structure. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's confounding. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Awesome. I have Chris. Hi, Chris.
Thanks. Excellent. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can. Hi, Chris.
Yeah. Yeah. So my main thing was around, is it possible to utilize AI in regards to monitoring some of these? I know with brainworm and moose in Saskatchewan, I come from Saskatchewan where it's CWD, very contaminated, but
Hmm.
in BC now, and I'm a hunter in BC. So, these areas that are more impacted, mainly that you disclosed Castleguard, and would there be an opportunity from a provincial to work with the nations there over in that part of the world? I am Indigenous, so I I don't follow the rigid harvesting regime of the regulatory, and I've done I guess euthanized elk in Saskatchewan that were problematic for our rural farmers with their sort of their hay stockpiles. But just kind of a question around AI and then the use of partnering with some of the indigenous groups there, the Kanaka Nation, if that's
Mhm.
a possibility, because I know from some of my other work with Indigenous Guardians, there was some Indigenous Guardians funded from that specific area of BC.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean that working with the First Nations partners, especially the ones like within the territory, the Ktunaxa, where their within their territory has been affected, and so we are working in full partnership with Ktunaxa in our CWD response, and but working with First Nations partners across the province too, in planning and just getting the Indigenous perspectives and just knowledge of the land and working with the guardian programs. I mean, that has been super valuable and really important to do that in full partnership. And so, absolutely, that's a really key component of our work here.
Okay, thank.
Um,
And
yeah.
what about the AI component? Is that possible to just identify an animal that has the symptoms, or is there just no symptoms whatsoever that
Yeah, the only way, so the way that we diagnose this disease is by Um, we extract specific tissues that are known to accumulate these prions early in early stages of disease. So we try to catch it as early as possible. And so that is a specific lymph node at the back of the throat on all the animals. And then on deer, we actually also look at tonsils, and on the elk and moose and caribou, we look at part of the brainstem. So these are areas where the prions will accumulate first. And to diagnose the disease, we'll extract these tissues, and we send them to our lab in our agriculture lab in Abbotsford. And they actually do an assay there that is going to identify the presence of the prions in those tissues. And so that is the only reliable way to, and of course you can't determine if the prions are present just by looking, or even under a microscope or something like that. There's no way. So there's two key diagnostic tests right now that are used to identify those prions in that specific tissue. There's certainly been advancements in the different testing tools, the diagnostic tools over the last decade, even the last 5 years. And there are some really promising results in more highly sensitive testing tools that can now detect prions in different tissues, can detect, of course, with our gold standard testing right now, you can only test for this disease in dead animals, because the animal has to be dead for you to be able to collect these tissues. But these new tools that are not yet approved, but are showing great promise, can show the presence of prions in uh, in biopsies, in a section of like a biopsy from the ear, or like other tissues, and they can identify prions in environmental samples, um, in like saliva and urine and things like that. So I'm really hopeful that those more sensitive tools are going to become available to us, um, and uh, and there is some opportunity in like research right now to try and explore those and utilize those tools, to try and kind of validate them and ground truth them. But they right now are not reliable enough to replace our those gold standard tools that have been approved for surveillance. The other thing that I've heard of, and I don't know much about this, but there's some work in the States where they're training dogs to be able to identify uh, prions in animals or in the environment. And again, I don't know much about it, but it just there's a lot of work being done right now to try and advance this and try and figure out some other ways that we might be able to identify this disease in these animals without having to go through this our testing process is kind of arduous right now, and so I hope that we'll be able to get some shiny new tools down the road, and hopefully like get empower hunters with that too, with like animal side tests and rapid tests, similar to what we were, the rapid testing that was developed after the COVID pandemic, some of like swabs, like you imagine being able to swab an animal and test them right there. So that could be coming. We don't have them right now, but I'm hopeful there's a lot that there's a lot of work being put towards advancing those other tools right now.
Thanks so much, you guys. Ava, I see that you've put a question up or a couple questions up. Please feel free to jump in. I'm just checking to see if Ava's still online with us. She might have had to sneak out. Yeah, you're there, Ava. You might just not have been able to find your unmute button. Look for that little microphone piece.
Hi
There
there,
you
can
go.
you hear me okay?
We can.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks for your time and engaging conversation tonight. I had two kind of quick questions, and I'm sorry if they've already been covered by the time you get to them, but I was wondering where CWD is thought to have originated, like geographically, and how it arose, because I've heard sort of rumors and different ideas about it, and I'm wondering what the consensus is now. And for my second question is, where should people be reporting suspected symptomatic deer in BC, especially in other parts of BC? What's the appropriate like reporting channels? And if there's any sort of clear symptoms, I know we see lots of things on social media, and I'm wondering what like the sort of scientific approach to symptomatic deer is. Thanks again for your time. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you, Ava. Okay, so first of all, with where did chronic wasting disease originate? We don't really know for sure, but what I can say is the first documented cases were confirmed in the 1960s in Colorado, in a research facility in Colorado, where they had deer and elk on the premises, and these animals were sick and they died, and they didn't know what it was at that time. It hadn't been described yet. So it wasn't until the 1970s chronic wasting disease was described, and then they looked back to those cases in the 1960s in the Colorado facility, and said, okay, that's chronic wasting disease. So that's going back to kind of Colorado, and Wyoming was sort of the original epicenter. There were some captive animals that were diagnosed with the disease at that time, or they had died, and they determined that that's what they had died from. And but before at that time, we knew nothing about chronic wasting disease, and so it managed to um, sort of cross over the fence, basically, from that captive population and into the wild populations, and then kind of spread in that geographic area. It then those free-ranging animals interacted with some farms, and then it got into the farming captive industry, and then that's really when it started to move larger distances, because people were then moving their farmed animals to different farms around the States. And that's actually how it got into Canada in the 1990s, was through game farmed elk, and that's what brought it into Saskatchewan. And so that's what we know about where, or like what we think the kind of consensus is, that that's probably where it originated. There were some sheep on that premises that had the sheep prion disease called scrapie. And we don't know this, there's no direct evidence of this, but there were some theories that potentially the prion evolved or morphed and jumped into the deer on that premises, and that was how that may have happened. And we've seen over the last number of decades, and like recent research is showing that the prions, the CWD prions, are evolving, and there are different strains being identified now, just like, when like the flu virus, will evolve and change over time. We're seeing that with the CWD prion as well. So now we have a few different strains out there, and so there is potential for that to happen. So maybe that's what happened originally. Your question about symptomatic deer. So that's a great question. I talked earlier about how most animals that are infected are not going to show symptoms because we don't have that immune response. It being a prion, the body doesn't recognize it as something that shouldn't be there, and so the animal just goes along happily while those prions are doing the damage inside the body, and the animal's shedding the prion, but they're not showing any symptoms until they actually start to experience that neurological deterioration, the damage to the brain tissue. That said, we know what the disease can look like at that late stage, and so it's kind of starts with some behavioral changes. Animals might lose fear of people, or they may, just kind of be a little bit slow. So it's suggested that animals with kind of this disease are just starting to show some behavioral changes, are going to be more vulnerable to being hit by vehicles on the road. And so that's why roadkill samples are a really important sample for us. As we move into kind of the late stages of disease, which really only present for the last like week or two before the animal dies, we know what this looks like mainly from research facilities. So when you look at chronic wasting disease on the internet, you look that up and you'll see images of these very thin, almost like depressed looking animals. Ears are down, they're drooling. They will often just be described as having poor coordination, sort of that neurological type effect, poor coordination, stumbling, trembling, frequent, just kind of standing in one place and drinking and urinating. We've observed those kinds of conditions in research facilities mainly. But of course, if anyone observes an animal exhibiting anything like that anywhere in BC, we absolutely want to hear about it. And there are some rare cases where in other places where we call clinical or symptomatic animals have been reported. And that's actually where the first case of chronic wasting disease in Libby, Montana, just in Northwest Montana, the first case in Libby, Montana was a symptomatic deer that that was in town, and it was in such poor shape that they actually euthanized it and tested it, and that was their first case in Libby, Montana. So it does happen, and so we definitely want to know about that. We want to hear about that if anyone observes animals exhibiting those symptoms. And I would say there's probably the best channel for reporting that is to the conservation officer's RAP line. If you guys are familiar with the RAP line, the main reason I say that is because it's 24/7. You can call to that line, and then depending on where you're calling from, the operator can put you in touch with somebody in your area, probably a conservation officer that will be working evenings and weekends, and depending on what time you're making the report. And then they triage to us. So if they get a report like that, then they'll come to us. If it's on a weekend or an evening and they can't reach us, then they might go and investigate and determine, if we need to collect samples or dispatch the animal. The other option, of course, is just to contact us directly. So if you look at our website, we have contact information. We have a CWD email that's monitored by a few different people, so that's a good avenue. It's just cwd@gov.bc.ca. or else our website has our phone numbers and contact information on there too, so you can always reach out to us directly. We always really appreciate those reports, especially if you see something to take pictures or a video is really helpful to us. You know, because there's lots of things that can ail animals out there, and the wildlife veterinarian that I work for is able to tell a lot from a photo or a video. And you know, if it's not chronic wasting disease, it hopefully it's not. But you know, it could be any number of things, and we're interested in knowing, you know, all the different, you know, all the different ailments that animals are experiencing out there. That's our job to keep track of that. So we always appreciate those reports.
Thanks a lot, Ava. Thanks for coming and participating. Grant, I see your hand up. Just ahead of you is Seb. Has a great question in there. Seb, if you're still with us, give yourself an unmute tap and join in.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. My question's from a human health perspective, and I'm sure it'll come up lots in these talks. But yeah, just wondering if chronic wasting disease has been around for 40, 50 years in various jurisdictions, just why we don't know if it can be transmitted to humans, sort of what needs to be studied, or if it isn't. And then yeah, I've heard or read that it already has been proven to jump species barriers, and you mentioned sheep there as well too, but I've heard in mink. So yeah, if it's already doing that, yeah, what else is needed or can be done there? So
Yeah, great question. Yeah, mink. Well, there's a number of prion diseases, like I mentioned. Mink have their own prion disease. There's a feline prion disease. There's a couple of different human ones. Sheep and goats have scrapie. Cattle have their BSC or mad cow. So specifically though about the evidence of human transmission of CWD transmitting to people. Couple challenging things about prion diseases in general, but particularly in people, is they have a very long incubation period. So they're with mad cow disease, I think it's like 10 or 12 years before an individual will start to show symptoms. Another human prion disease is called Kuru, and there was a situation with a population. Where was it? I think it was like Papua New Guinea or something like that, and there was as part of their ceremony, they it was like a cannibalistic culture or ceremony. And so when an elder died in the village, they would consume parts of the body, and so the other people became infected with this. But it was really interesting that the men in the village would consume the like muscle tissue, and the women and children would consume the organs. And because we know that with prion diseases, you'll have a higher concentration of prions in organs or in like the central nervous system and the brain. And so the women and children got sick earlier than the men. The men, it was like upwards of 20 years before they started to show symptoms, just because of that initial prion load. Anyway, maybe I'm going a little too much detail here, but all is to say, the point being is that there's this long incubation period. So it's really hard to connect. If you've consumed a CWD infected deer, there potentially could be a long period of time before any symptoms develop. The other problem with that is that we don't know how it would present in humans, and because it's like a neurological disease, like there's lots of other neurological diseases that maybe they just don't know what it would look like. So it could be that it's misdiagnosed. But again, I'm not a public health expert, and the public health folks that I work with, you know, and they've just recently done a comprehensive review of the current evidence around human transmission, and they say there's no direct evidence that this could be happening, but there's a lot of complicating factors of why it's not like easy to just to understand if this can transmit to people, and of course there's, you know, we're not going to do a an experiment and ask people to consume infected meat and see what happens. They've done some animal research, looking at some non-human primates, where in some cases, you know, monkeys have consumed infected deer and have become infected with chronic wasting disease, and in other cases they didn't. And so the outcome of that sort of body of work has just kind of left us with some inconsistent findings around this potential for human transmission. So it's tricky. And you know, something that I know public health is very interested in. There's some studies in the States, sort of survey-based studies that poll different, you know, people in the hunting community that have been harvesting and consuming animals from CWD endemic areas, and just, you know, asking them, you know, by questionnaires and things like that, you know, what their experience is, you know, how long have they been consuming presumably infected deer meat. And so they're starting to collect that data to see if there's any trends, but yeah, it's still a bit of a unfortunately a bit of a mystery.
Okay, that was just such great dialogue because you know, honestly, like that is super complex, right? It's not like we would eat, you know, infected CWD and then be sick in a month.
Yeah.
I had no idea that incubation period could be
Mm.
such a huge factor. I'm just blown away. I have Grant, and then after Grant, I have Brett. Hi, Grant.
Hey there. Good to see you, Cait.
Hi, Grant.
You and I have chatted a fair bit on and off about CWD, and something you said just kind of twigged me to something I hadn't thought about before. Um, it's bothered me for a while that we have this little cluster in Cranbrook and this one outlier. Um, you mentioned different strains of CWD. Have we confirmed that all six are the same strain?
No, we haven't yet. We're working on that. So when we had those positive cases identified, we submitted our backup samples to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that does the confirmatory testing, and they are going to be doing strain typing of these to, you know, really the objective there is to see if we could link it to a strain, you know, either in Alberta or Montana. But you know, we don't have that information yet. So we don't know. But I can say that we are looking at this cluster around Cranbrook and the case in a mule deer that was Englishman Creek Rec site closer to the Montana border as two separate disease events, if you will. They are within the, you know, natural range of animals moving between them. But because we tested, you know, so many hundreds of animals this year in kind of the area in between and didn't have any additional positive cases, we believe that these are two sort of isolated situations. It's possible that that mule deer case in the south, and again, we will never know for sure, but it's possible that that was a mule deer that wandered up from Montana, or you know, something like that, Montana or uh, Idaho. But we did, you know, both through our targeted sampling immediately after that case was identified, and then through the hunter sample this fall, we tested a ton of animals from that area and haven't identified any further cases. So it takes the pressure off a little bit from that. In contrast, these cases around Cranbrook are a bit different because we are seeing multiple cases. And because of the association with like the urban deer population, there is a higher risk there of it, kind of building and spreading and growing in that area and contaminating the environment. So we really want to make sure that we don't let that get away on us. But importantly, I think I touched on this earlier in the presentation, that the evidence is suggestive that that disease that's has possibly come in not from an animal moving from another area, but has come in on an infected carcass or a or infected feed material or hay, and brought to the area, and then has exposed the animals in the area to this disease. So, that takes a different type of approach, right? And super important kind of education and kind of community outreach around that and around that messaging and those risks, that all the things. It's very difficult to manage this disease with natural animal spread, like natural animal movement on the landscape. Um, but we don't want to make it worse by humans also moving it on the landscape and potentially farther distances from the source. So anyway, I think that's just good to keep in mind here, and to keep in mind that this really could pop up anywhere in BC. And so our focus is really in the management zone around Cranbrook right now, but we have to be aware that this could pop up anywhere. So sorry, I kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent there, Grant, but to answer your question, that yeah, we hope to identify the strains of these cases, but we don't have that information yet.
Do you know what the timeline on that would be?
I don't actually. It didn't seem like it was going to happen quickly, because the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is strain typing all of the cases from Canada, so our small collection is just in that queue.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
That's going to be really neat information.
Mm-hmm.
Like imagine if we go, oh, Cranbrook, you've got, Southeast Alberta strain of CWD, and
Yeah.
and I think, as a horse person, and having been in the position of importing hay, it's really that eyes wide open, and we talk about the endemic in the environment, and that, it kind of boggles my mind a little bit, and it gives me a little bit of fear that these prions can get into plant material and infect, we move that plant material across provinces, or we export how much hay out of Washington, Idaho, Alberta, Saskatchewan is exported over to Japan, and
Yeah.
and things like that. I mean, we compete
Mm-hmm.
when we're buying hay, we compete with those export markets on our
Yeah.
hay sources. So
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah.
the movement of things in and around it is really
Mm-hmm.
shocking. Anyways, I could go on and on. Brett, you're next up with your questions. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming.
I didn't know if I was going to get put on or not. I was just kind of throwing some questions out. I've definitely been like compelled with research on this myself and listening. And I think, Cait, like one of the key things I saw that was just wonderful was the getting hunters to turn in heads, get sampling done. It didn't involve killing extra animals. I mean, a call of 20 animals was there. It didn't have to be. BC is definitely different from Saskatchewan, Alberta, where you can have a deer live in 4 square kilometers its whole life. Here, they're migratory. Where I live, they're in the States back and forth. It's going to be just too hard with the control. But killing excess animals for sampling, it had that initial merit. I just don't think that's going to be one of the solutions. Really excited one day if hopefully we can do this without killing extra animals. I mean, but right now, hunter involvement, sampling is key, because hunters are going to get animals. They're going to hopefully transport their animals, get them tested, dispose them in landfills. They're buried.
Mm-hmm.
But like Amberly said, hay and everything else. Free grazing cattle are going to be spreaders. Birds of prey are going to be spreaders. Bears, wolves, coyotes. A grizzly bear can munch on a dead carcass infected with CWD and shit all over Hell's Half Acre, and those prions are going to be everywhere, and that's going to be hard. I mean, you could say let's involve them in the management. That's going to lead to a lot of anger if we said let's just kill all the bears now because they're going to spread these prions too. So hopefully one day it can be detected, blue light, infrared, something, who knows, right? But right now, in BC with the migratory animals and everything else, like it was proposed about elk and everything else, different times of the year, you can't because they're migratory. You don't know which ones are coming. Like it looks like they're coming up from the U.S. and they're migrating around. You're going to have these populations, but like those deer in Utah that can go 220 miles in their migration routes.
Yeah.
That's a huge area. And then also I was just thinking like the prions and the human transmission, like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is a human prion disease. And there was that study in that neurology magazine where they found those hunters that ate a lot of CWD infected meat did get CWD and they were the same group. But it's an isolated group of 2 people, so they don't have the statistics to say, is there higher incidence of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease with eating infected meat? And that might be one of the tests they're going to have to do is anyone diagnosed with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, their history. Did you consume meat? Where did you consume it? Just knowledge, studies, data is going to help. There's no doubt. And like I said, I think the greatest thing I've seen is just that hunters are doing their part. They're turning their heads and hopefully disposing of animals in a safe manner so that people aren't the reason it's spreading as much. Because animals are going to spread it themselves. We can't control that. But, I don't know. That's just kind of like my 2 bits worth, but also just like free range cattle and predators. Like, I mean, I don't know if there's ever been talk on the table about that, but clearly farmers that let their cattle go all over the area, if there's isolated populations of deer and they're letting them free range, they're going to be a possible spreader as well. So I don't know if that's being addressed or being brought up in this world out there or not.
Yeah, you have some great points there, Brett, and I agree with all of that. Yeah, I mean, we're looking at all facets of this, all parts of the system that could be contributing, right? And a lot of it, we're just trying to understand right now, and get a sense of it. But I mean, I think the most important point that you had, which I fully agree with, is just the incredible support that we've had from the hunting community. Hunters have absolutely shown up for us. We would not have a program at all without hunters providing those samples so that we have, sound information to base our management strategies on. But also just like the act of hunting itself, hunting to continue to hunt in these areas. There's so many important benefits of hunting and hunter participation in CWD management. Hunters, unfortunately, we had 3 hunters that had positive animals this year. I'm, I was grateful that it was only three phone calls that we had to make, but for those 3 individuals, it was devastating. And I hate having to, it's heartbreaking to have those conversations. But what I tried to relay to those hunters is that those 3 individuals did more for CWD management than anyone else, than more than I did this year, because they took infected animals off the landscape to help control that, to help suppress that transmission cycle and that environmental contamination. And that's what hunters do. They show up and they do this. They seek out the information. They want to do things properly, handle these carcasses as safely as possible. Get these samples in to support us. So we really couldn't do it without the hunting community. So yeah, that means everything for
But
us.
I wanna chime in because you and I have had some, some really good conversations about it, and I hear that there's this deep, grave concern for CWD is 100% fatal, and so is a hunter removing a deer from the landscape, 100% fatal. And with all of these other factors of potential spreads, it almost becomes like, is there even any point? And is over harvesting, or what we perceive may be an over harvest in order to gain that sampling necessary, are we fighting a losing battle? You know, Cait, and I think this is a really good point where I think I would like to try and emphasize, would we rather have 2% of deer on the landscape with CWD, or 25% of the deer on the landscape that are going to die and not be edible with CWD, or up to 50%, or in the case of southern Saskatchewan, we now have 85% mule deer buck that
Mm-hmm.
are harvested are positive. So I always just try to remind myself, because I'm not the one out there pulling the trigger on them, and I recognize there is this broader feeling in the hunting community of, our animal populations are already in decline, and now
Mm-hmm.
this, and now there's
Mm-hmm.
more, and
Mm-hmm.
there's, you know, it's a real sense of feeling helpless and that kind of stuff. And I guess where I try to sort of bring myself is just that I don't want 25% on the landscape, and I don't want the elk infected and then the moose infected, and you know,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of stuff. If we could keep our hunting community together and knit and go forward with a couple of years of this management, and allow for some of these harvests that put meat in the freezer for people,
Mm-hmm.
and then we can really, I think, really try and contain it, because now we're not only trying to contain it, we're actually trying to protect those herds around it. Right?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Hard though. Like, I hear you, Brett.
Mm-hmm.
I feel it every time we talk. Like, the
Mm-hmm.
concern is real, and there's this feeling of, oh my God, now it's just one more thing on the land. If it's not CWD, it's hunters, and we're, you know, declining populations, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just, it's hard decisions. Really,
It
really
is.
hard.
It,
Well, it is hard because proportionally, you take more animals, you're going to find more. But is it a disproportional kind of sampling just because you're harvesting more than what was
mm,
there? I mean, you want to have hunter opportunity, you want to have animals, but if you take out more animals, you're going to have less. So is it
mm-hmm.
the cat chasing its own tail? It's a hard one because which is going to be more beneficial in the long run? Except that
Mm-hmm.
clearly studies, science, um, sampling is going to be necessary. I think the bit where I always got off is more the time of year sampling, like the November, December, January, February. You know, when you can't sample migratory elk in a flatland area and pregnant cows that come from the highlands up the Bull River and say that's an accurate reflection of the valley bottom. So that's just going to involve study groups talking. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's working the right way. There's no doubt. It's just
Yeah.
and I think telling hunters what to do, you get the people rebelling. I mean, if someone's told what to do, there's always gonna be a few kids that don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the good of it, turn in your heads, get the samples done. Let's see where it's going, and
Mm-hmm.
then those will lead to the decisions for the future. Nothing's being done. I think there at the beginning there was some drastic thoughts, and they're tapering down, going. Time it's not going to be solved tomorrow. It's too big of an area. There's too many animals, and they're all over
Mm-hmm.
the place. So
Yeah.
working together is going to be the key.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we have an opportunity, I think, because we sampled so many animals from this area. And really, the vast majority were just from the regular harvest of testing harvested animals, right? With no adjustment to the season this last year. And so we learned so much. We've identified this cluster of cases, and I think we've really been given an opportunity, maybe a small golden window where we can address this situation in this small geographic area around Cranbrook. Maybe turn the dial up a little bit on an aggressive approach to harvest additional animals from that area. But what we're trying to achieve there, like Amberly said, is we're trying to protect the broader population. And if we can do that, and if we can contain it here, then we're not going to have to, there's not going to be impacts through management or through disease in these other areas if we can do this right. And so from our, the regular hunter harvest and roadkill animals that we can access as well for testing, we get everything that we need for testing. And then it's when we like to achieve our surveillance targets for these areas to understand what's going on the land. And then it's when we identify these positive cases and that picture becomes clearer so we can understand, okay, what is the situation and what are the appropriate tools for this situation, then we can really zero in. And I believe that we've been given an opportunity to do that in this apparently early stage of the disease in BC. Well, we have a chance to do it. So yeah, I agree. We have to work together. Everyone has to be on board. I mean, like I said, we're not going to have 100% agreement, but we definitely value the input and the perspectives of our partners and the hunting community because we have to figure out a way to address this in lockstep together as partners.
One last just quick question for sampling. Is there, because I've been in like a medical field for the last 34 years, so this might be kind of crude. Can it be detected in fecal samples of bears, wolves, deer at all?
Yeah, yes, in a research setting, they have been able to identify prions in the fecal material of those carnivores. It's not a test that we have available. That like samples have to go back to the lab, and they have some of those specialized, highly sensitive tools in those situations. But it is possible, and those were some of the tools that I was speaking to. That hopefully we can ground truth. We can continue to ground truth and validate those so that they can become more accessible for surveillance purposes.
Robin, I do see your hand up, and if you're related into this, kind of part of the conversation at all, please do let me know. But I feel like this is a really good time to talk about some of the things that hit social media around some potential upcoming proposals and this kind of thing. And I think, one of the things that I've personally struggled with is I see, a proposal come forward that says, okay, we're going to increase harvest or we're going to, we need more samples of this. Sometimes, Cait, and I'm wondering if there's steps being taken kind of through the government and sort of that top-down engagement process. One of the things that I think gets missed is context. And so if we're going to issue, so we, for example, there was, I think, was there 120 permits that were issued for February of this year? And then there was, what, 35% of those were actually harvested animals. And so there's talking points or pieces of information that I think people don't always get that fail to deliver context. If we're going to do an increased hunt in December and January, people have to, the managers, I'm assuming, are going to have, okay, we're going to open up the season for one more bag limit for each hunter for this period of time. And based on previous harvest levels, we're expecting 200 animals to be harvested over this. Whereas sometimes the perception ends up being, oh my God, the province is going to descend in December and January to get that last buck and all of that kind of thing. Do you know where I'm kind of going with this? Is the
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
perspectives are being missed because
Mhm.
if 100 tags is going out, it's not necessarily meaning that people are expecting 100 deer to come off the land.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that context piece is really important. And again, and part of our kind of continuous learning process and planning process and seeing how these things play out, and then adjusting as needed is really important for that context. So yeah, the permit hunt, I think we ended up with it was 119 tags and 36 animals harvested. And so coming into, future proposals for a special hunt or a permit hunt in this area, to try and get, target this specific population where we know there's positive cases, and um, get a few more animals out of that specific area, where we know it's a higher likelihood of some more infected animals. And when we talk about the current context too of chronic wasting disease in this area is, based on our surveillance data, we're talking about a 0.1% of samples have come back positive. So it's a very small number of animals on the landscape. And so with this, special hunt, the goal is to go and remove infected animals, but chances are the vast majority will be um, uh, um, healthy animals and can be food for people and can go into people's freezers. But it's all working towards this goal of containing the disease in the specific area so that it's not allowed um, to spread and threaten the surrounding populations and populations in the rest of BC. We're talking about a very, very distinct geographic area right now where we have an opportunity. But you're absolutely right. When those types of proposals come forward, that type of context is considered by the managers, that we're not anticipating, um, that every hunter that comes into that area is going to harvest an animal, and so they recognize that, and that's very carefully considered in terms of what the population can handle.
Awesome. We've hit that little golden hour of 8:30, and I'm certainly, I don't think any of us is in a rush to boot the audience off. If there's some more questions out there, does anybody else want to chime in, stick your hand up, or, you're not interrupting except me for blathering, so jump in if anybody has anything more to add. Jake, hey.
Hi there. I just had a quick question about something you mentioned earlier about strains of CWD. I've never heard of different strains, but in CWD, but I've heard a little bit about it in terms of viruses. Are the strains similar to, say, a virus, which as it evolves, it tends to get less deadly to the host and more contagious for reproduction purposes, or is there anything that you know that you can tell us about the different strains?
Yeah, what I've learned about the different strains, and again, this isn't my area of expertise, but I can share with you what the bits and pieces that I have um, picked up from this, is that what they're seeing is slightly different strains in different species, for one. And so the different strains may be more, like a particular strain might be more readily transmitted through elk, for example. Um, and so that's one piece of evidence on the different strains. Another thing that has been observed is a difference in um, the pathology, like how the disease actually impacts that animal. So with different strains, you may see that, like, in the time from infection to death as being a shorter period of time or longer with the different strains. And so they're just seeing some variability kind of in those kind of contexts. I haven't heard anything about um, uh, if the strains are becoming, stronger or more resilient or anything like that, because they're kind of all pretty nasty. But they are identifying some variability, and in part is associated with, different species.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm quite keen on on understanding a little bit about those different strains too. And I think just because, I mean, we went from, you know, COVID-19A to COVID-19 ZZ and you know, but kind of, but still in a similar way, you know, some strains were made people sicker, some strains you know, were designed to not kill the host because then that doesn't help the, you know, the virus and that sort of thing. Dave Ryder, Vice President of Hunters for BC.
Before we do Dave, we had
Oh.
a couple of follow-up questions from Chris in the chat.
Oh, I apologize, Chris. I missed that.
Yeah.
Oh, did you want me to speak to it?
Sure.
Just zoom back. It was mainly around you mentioned around the urinalysis. So capturing the urine, and that's why I was kind of putting that in there and then tethering it to the use of AI powered motion cameras then to basically identify the deer. And if they did in fact test positive, then to euthanize them obviously and dispose of them properly. That's where I was kind of going with that theme. And we are in the age of technology, and the heads being turned in is very important. I can speak from my personal experience. I never turn in heads because as an Indigenous person, always scrutinized from the crown of the crown ponies. So I've had very adverse experiences with and numerous other Indigenous harvesters have. And I suppose it would be different if it's being done with those specific nations in that jurisdiction, right? But yeah, I just wanted to bring that to the forefront because I know a lot of non-Indigenous harvesters and Indigenous harvesters alike. You know, sometimes people don't want to turn on the heads because of being scrutinized, right? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Good points. And yeah, and that's also a really interesting comment about pairing sort of that different sampling methodology with the AI, with cameras. And that was something that we talked a little bit about too with Grant that was on earlier with a project utilizing, you know, some field sampling uh, for environmental sampling and testing of saliva samples, and then pairing that with cameras to see if we could actually identify individuals. And yeah, so yeah, there are lots of cool technologies out there that I think we could definitely pull into this. But also, I hear your points about, you know, and I know there's lots of people out there that have hesitations for various reasons and on submitting samples, and that's fair. But yeah, we're just hoping to kind of break down those barriers as much as possible by, you know, whether it's working with the First Nations communities. We're working with a number of nations in the province that are wanting to lead their own CWD surveillance programs and do sampling. Like, so we're supporting them to get trained so they can do their own sample collections in community. We can connect them with the labs, you know, they can manage all their own data. So very open to those types of arrangements just to try and break down some of those barriers and support communities in the questions that they want to, you know, answer and efforts that they want to do around this.
Thank you.
Did I miss anybody else? Dave Ryder, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Hi, Cait. How you doing tonight?
Hi, Dave. I'm good.
Good, Cait. I spent a lot of time in the Kootenays, and I do a lot of whitetail hunting and stuff over there. I have for the last just about 50 years. With the concept of targeting, like specifically in the Cranbrook area, and the data behind the cluster effect being a heavier contamination model, is there an ideal deer density discovered yet where it minimizes the spreading effect, like per kilometer, like 1.5 or 2.2 deer per kilometer? And if so, do you know what the relationship that is between that number and a healthy carrying capacity?
Yeah, great question, Dave.
Wow, Dave.
That's awesome.
Who plugged you in tonight?
So the short answer is we don't really have an ideal density to work towards, and that is because this disease behaves differently under different circumstances, and density is sort of just one factor. And so, of course, we look at situations like farms and captive herds that are really high density. Obviously, that's not a good thing for, disease transmission. There are some populations in some areas of the states that have incredibly high deer density, which is a problem for CWD. But in most other places in natural settings, density doesn't seem to be the primary kind of driver for this. For chronic wasting disease, it actually, they say it's more, um, it's not so much density dependent, but it's frequency dependent, is what we say. And so it's um, what's driving the disease is how the animals are using the landscape. And that's why they've really highlighted these things around unnatural aggregation, point source like food sources, urban deer populations, situations where you have animals, why we've identified, baiting and feeding of deer and elk as being problematic, because it brings animals into these kind of unnatural uh, uh, aggregations where there's a shared food source, and they come back and there's kind of like high fidelity or repeat visitation to these sites. So then as they're eating and they're sharing the food, that's when the disease is really spreading and getting into the environment. And then those sites become these kind of hotspots for disease transmission. And so more so than the density. And so so I guess that's the short answer. I mean, the density is definitely something that we need to pay attention to, but it's what has been documented in other places, and there's very strong evidence supporting the fact that this is more of a frequency dependent driven um, disease, and why we see these clusters of cases on the landscape as opposed to evenly distributed cases. It's all associated with animals in an area that they're sharing a food source, they're sharing that space, and then that's where that transmission is happening.
Okay, great. One of the other things to touch on, looking back over social media on CWD, there's also mention of a elk harvest possibly scheduled for late season this year. If so, what are the numbers behind that and the purpose?
Well, I can't really speak to that because there have been no decisions made around those proposals, but I can say that I am not aware of an elk harvest this year being proposed. There was some discussion early on with within our committee, because we know that given the location of these positive cases and the proximity to elk populations, elk are at risk of exposure. And so we are looking at elk really closely. We definitely want to keep it out of elk populations. But, by maintaining our mandatory testing just through the regular harvest, regular season of elk, we're getting good sample numbers. We're also getting good sample numbers from road-killed elk right now, like through the spring and summer. And so in those terms, we have good surveillance data. We haven't identified a positive case in elk yet. We know they are definitely at risk, but because of the proximity to these other cases. But as of right now, I'm not aware of any proposals for extended or special harvest of elk this year.
That's really great. I'm glad you could clarify that for a lot of the public. We could do our part too to make sure that knowledge gets out there correctly when we do see it come up. But okay, thank you very much, Cait. I do appreciate it, and great talking with you so far.
Thanks, Dave.
Well, team, I for the remaining audience, and I'm so pleased with the turnout tonight. There will be more. We have an info session planned next month, an info session planned the month after, and if we deem the participation and the interest to be high enough, we will be continuing to bring Cait, to hunters in the communities so that we can all continue to have conversations and that kind of stuff. So, Cait, as always, I feel like I just have these mind blown moments every time I'm in another one of these talks, and I just never stop learning. It's pretty crazy. So,
Well, thank you.
yeah.
I have to say I'm so grateful for everyone that came out tonight. This dialogue is excellent, and I really appreciate it. And it's so helpful for me too to connect. So thank you to Hunters for BC and Evan and Emberly for arranging this. This is such a great format. I'm really happy to participate. And yeah, please reach out anytime if you have any follow-up questions. And I really appreciate the participation tonight, and just
Cait, I apologize for interrupting you. I have a member, Sledge, who I have failed to make a question. Do we have 2 minutes for one more question?
for sure.
Sledge, are you still here with us? At least that's the name of your computer or phone.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering what resources are needed by frontline, like biology science participants, and what opportunities there are for hunters to directly volunteer. I think with any program, resources are needed. So how do we help that?
Yeah, it's true. Well, yeah, I think depending on where you are located, we're always looking for partnerships to help with our surveillance program. So that could be, arranging a community event or information session, connecting with, whether it's, if you have a business or part of a club, hosting an information session, hosting a freezer, just helping us to spread the word. That type of effort is always so welcome. We love to organize like sample collection training sessions, things like that as well, if there's interest for that. And then, yeah, just like connecting with people is just such a helpful way to learn from each other, and just like build awareness around this, and how we're going to do that. We're our program is stretched pretty thin, so we're doing our best, but collaborating with partners and communities, and those of you that are out there, you're our ears and eyes on the ground. We really need that support. So whatever we can do to like partner on some of these initiatives, that was always super helpful.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you everybody for your time today and the respectful dialogue. It's obviously something that's going to be very invoke some passionate responses from everyone. So thank you very much for being respectful. And we're hope to see you again at the next info session.
Good. See you in a month.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.